The Divine Exchange: How God's Sovereignty Transforms Worry into Unshakable Peace. Trusting God's sovereignty helps find peace in worries by fundamentally restructuring our understanding of reality. When we believe that God is in perfect control of all things, including the details of our lives and the events that cause anxiety, we no longer fear random chaos or meaningless suffering. This theological truth becomes the bedrock upon which anxious hearts find rest, transforming our entire perspective on circumstances that would otherwise overwhelm us. Eliminating the terror of randomness, God's sovereignty assures us that nothing happens outside His divine plan and that all things work together for good for those who love Him, as promised in Romans 8 verse 28. This eliminates what may be anxiety's greatest fuel: the fear that life is random, chaotic, or meaningless. When we truly grasp that our sovereign God controls every detail of existence, from the flight of birds to the rise and fall of nations, we no longer live at the mercy of chance or circumstance. The terror of randomness keeps us constantly vigilant, always anticipating the next disaster that could strike without warning or purpose. However, when we trust that our loving God governs all things according to His perfect will, this hypervigilance transforms into peaceful rest. We understand that every event, whether pleasant or painful, must first pass through God's sovereign hands before reaching our lives. Shifting perspective from human limitation to divine wisdom, this trust replaces anxiety with peace because it shifts our focus from our limited perspective to God's infinite wisdom and love. Our human viewpoint is necessarily narrow. We see only fragments of the larger picture, moments in time rather than eternity, immediate circumstances rather than ultimate purposes. This limited perspective breeds anxiety because we cannot see how current difficulties fit into any meaningful pattern. However, knowing that God is both all-powerful and perfectly loving means that He governs our lives with care and purpose, even in difficult circumstances. His perspective encompasses all of history, seeing the end from the beginning and understanding how every thread weaves into His perfect tapestry. When we trust His sovereignty, we essentially choose to rely on His infinite wisdom rather than our finite understanding. Biblical examples of sovereign peace: biblical examples such as King Hezekiah, King David, Elijah, Job, Moses, and Jesus show how trusting God's sovereignty brought them peace amid fear and anxiety. Each of these figures faced circumstances that would naturally produce overwhelming worry, yet they found supernatural peace by anchoring their trust in God's absolute control. King Hezekiah faced the overwhelming threat of the Assyrian Empire, yet his prayer acknowledged God as the sovereign ruler of all nations. David experienced intense persecution and wrote honestly about his fears in the Psalms, yet consistently declared God as his refuge and strength. Elijah felt isolated and threatened after his victory on Mount Carmel, but God's gentle whisper reminded him of divine presence and control. Job endured unimaginable suffering yet never abandoned his trust in God's sovereignty, ultimately declaring that God gives and takes away according to His will. Their stories demonstrate that God's presence and control can calm the most troubled hearts. These biblical figures teach us that trusting God's sovereignty doesn't eliminate difficult circumstances but transforms how we experience them. Practical application of sovereign trust: in practical terms, trusting God's sovereignty encourages us to cast our anxieties on Him as instructed in 1 Peter 5 verse 7, pray with thanksgiving as outlined in Philippians 4 verses 6 to 7, and rest in the assurance that God is working all things for our good. This creates a concrete pathway from worry to peace through specific spiritual disciplines. When anxiety arises, we can deliberately choose to transfer our burdens to God, knowing He has both the power and desire to carry them. Prayer becomes not just a religious duty but a practical tool for exchanging our limited perspective for God's infinite wisdom. Thanksgiving transforms our focus from what we lack or fear to what God has already provided and promised. Active faith, not passive resignation. This trust is not passive resignation but active faith that God is with us and for us, providing peace that surpasses all understanding. Trusting God's sovereignty doesn't mean becoming fatalistic or inactive. Instead, it means engaging with life's challenges from a position of security rather than fear. We can take appropriate action to address our concerns while resting in the knowledge that outcomes ultimately rest in God's hands. This eliminates the crushing pressure to control every variable and the anxiety that comes from feeling responsible for results beyond our power to guarantee. Divine control eliminates the terror of uncertainty and provides a secure foundation for our hearts and minds. In a world where change is constant and many factors remain beyond our control, God's unchanging sovereignty becomes an anchor for our souls. We may not know what tomorrow will bring, but we know who controls tomorrow, and that knowledge transforms fear into faith, worry into worship, and anxiety into the peace that guards our hearts and minds in Christ Jesus.